Right, hello there. We're continuing on today, day 2 of the room, IMVU room, that's a simple room, garage. So we've got it loaded in Blender. Just move some things around. And we want the starter file, the room starter file. Just drop those in chat. Copy, paste. So if you're using 2.8 and above, you want those. If you're using the older version of Blender, you want these. So those are your starter files for Blender 2.79 and Blender 2.80. So we're using the one for Blender 2.80, obviously. So we shall continue with our garage, our simple garage. So what we can do today is we'll drop in a garage door, see if we can drop in a garage door in here. So we'll make use of this post and this corner post, and we'll add a beam across there. So we'll take out much of this, and then what we'll also do is just give it a flat roof, one of those ones that leaks all the time. So we'll just put a couple of beams across and from the back to the front. And then what we can do then is fill in, oh, we'll actually need some, what do they call these ones on the edges? Base plates. And then we'll fill in these gaps to create the ceiling. But before we do that, what we can do is, so we've got our windows and our doors. So what would you do if you wanted to create a window frame? So even though this is a garage, so we're talking like basic construction, what would you do if you wanted to place a window frame around that? Just a simple wooden frame. Well, what we can do for that, well, there's a couple of ways of doing it actually, but where's the cursor gone? So there's the cursor. So I'm just going to snap the cursor to one of the windows, well, this window that we're looking at, so this window. I'm going to snap that cursor to there because we want the object that we're going to add to the scene to appear at the cursor and in place, so we don't have to keep hunting around for it because it's off screen somewhere and or unnecessarily moving it into position. So we select that wall, edit mode, face select, so face, edge, vertex. We want face, make sure we've got that window selected. And then it's, where have they moved this now? Trying to find the menu. Where is it? That's weird. Can never find things when you need to find them. Local view, cameras, viewpoint, navigation, align view. Don't want to align view. We don't want to select. Honestly. Oh, there we go. Snap. Weird place to put it, but there we go. So snap, and what we want is cursor to selected. Whoops, mesh, snap, cursor to selected. And it moves the cursor into position, but we might want to also reorientate it because it's off kilter. So in the sidebar, so we've already got that visible. We want to view 3D cursor. Oh, we don't want to change its position. What we want to do is change its rotation. Just to double check. That just straightens it up, and then exit edit mode, and then add mesh cube. That'll add a cube, and what we want to do is shape this relative to our window, and we can do this in object mode. Or we could do this in edit mode. The difference being that if we're in edit mode and we do this, we don't have to set or reset the object. We don't have to reset it using apply. So apply rotation and scale. If we do that in object mode, change its shape in object mode, we don't have to worry about that. So that'll do. Select the front face and we'll do an inset. And then what we can do here is extrude that backwards. So let's go into wireframe so this is easier to see. So that's the limit of our box. So that's our cube. What we're going to do is push this face backwards. So extrude, push it backwards. We don't have to be terribly accurate with this, but if we want to snap to the grid, hold the control key down, and that'll snap to that back face. We can select that original back face, get rid of that, so X or delete. So we now have an empty back, and then we can do one of two things. We can either select these front faces, duplicate them, so that's mesh duplicate, so we have a duplicate, escape to reset or right click, and then we can hold control down and pull that to the back. I'll have to invert those so they're all facing the right way. And that creates a frame. So in the same way that we did with the window and the doors originally, what we're doing is essentially reusing elements that we already have and just duplicating them and reusing them. So we could have done that, or the other way would have pinned 2. Let's just delete those, we don't need them. Edge select. Select our edges, and then vertex, new face. So we create a face to fill that gap. And we just go around the mesh, filling those faces. So that's 2 ways to make a basic frame. So let's edit this a little bit. Face select. Because we don't necessarily want it so if that's our back wall, what we want to do, let's bring this in a little bit. And that creates a frame. So what we might also have to do with this, because we've put a frame there, we'd have to reduce the size of the glass window pane that we've got. So we have to select our wall, so we exit edit mode for the framework. And then change the size of that, so a little bit of scaling. And then we can come back to that if we need to. Because we don't want any gaps. So we can do the same thing for the door, but because we've already got one framework frame set up, we can just duplicate that, move it into place, edit mode, and just reuse it. So we want to select a loop, so that's all these faces. We want to loop select that, so we need to hold down the Alt key and click, and that selects the loop. So let's go into, what viewport will it be? Front? No. Right. So let's use the views. So this is our doorway. This is obviously the framework that we've got. And all we're going to do is just grab that and move it. We're going to get rid of this bottom edge. We don't need that. But we're going to move that to frame the doorway. And it doesn't really matter that they're not exactly the same size. So we'll select that bottom one. So we've got the loop selected. I'm going to delete that. X. Is there an extra face in there? Yes, there is. Delete that. Vertex. So the shortcut keys, you want to get used to those. That's the number 1, 2 and 3. 1 for vertex, 2 for edges and 3 for faces. And there is a simple door frame. And again, it might mean adjusting the actual door, well, the flat plane that represents the door. Because we didn't detach that, that's still attached to our mesh. So select, where was it? Faces, nope, nope. Oh, mesh split, there we go. See, what they've done with Blender 2.8 is they've moved some of the options that were available in each of the main element menus, so vertex, edge and face, and they've dropped them into a mesh menu. That's why it's sometimes tricky to find things, because they've been moved around. So split. Oh, we didn't really have to move it by that much. Edge. So that is a door frame. So again, we are trying to, whoops, we're trying to reuse as much of the mesh structure as possible, because this is just a simple room and a lot of it contains repetitive elements. But obviously this now means that you can edit each of these relative to the appearance that you want. So if you wanted to create a molded door frame, you can do that easily to this sub element without affecting the main back wall section, because that's separate. So let's put in a windowsill. So what we can do for that is select two edges, and then from the edge menu, subdivide. That creates a new edge that we can just drag down, holding Control, and it'll snap it into a position that we can use to extend out our sill. So do the same thing on the other side. So we're going to do a bit of face reorganization here. Select the faces, then face, triangulate faces. So that now creates these two that we can select alongside the front, one at the front, we can extrude that outwards a little bit more. And these sides and if you want, do the back, although you'd be looking into the room through the window. Then we want to reorganize these back into a quad. So we've got two triangles at the moment, and what we want is a quad. So select them, so shift click, face, tris to quads. It's not absolutely necessary to do this, but it means that were we to do any more editing to this at some point in the future, we've got a relatively clean structure to work with. Let's give these a material. Frames. So we've assigned that to one of our objects. Click the other one, and then to assign the same material, click the Browse Material to be Linked button, and then we've got a selection of materials that we can assign. So what we want to do now is duplicate those, escape to reset, or right click if you've got your, depending on how you've got your mouse set up, rotate, snap to the grid, holding control down, that's 90 degrees. And then just move these into position. Like so. What we might have to do, because we've got a window, not a window, we've got a window and a door frame. Let's just hide these for the moment. Because if we have a door frame and a window frame, we don't need these surfaces. So there's 4 of them, top and side, and the same for the door. We don't need those, so we can remove them. But rather than delete them outright in case we want them for something else, or we want to use them at some point, what we can do with these is mesh, separate, selection, and that detaches them as separate objects, which we can then hide. Whoops, wrong one. Do the same for the door, but we want to keep the bottom one because that's part of the floor. Same again. because it then means, so that's our frame. Because what that does is it avoids Z fighting or clipping. So if you have two surfaces that are close together in IMVU, you get this flickering effect because the two surfaces are basically fighting to be drawn on the screen. And it's called Z fighting or Z fighting for that reason, because the two surfaces or multiple surfaces are trying to be drawn to screen at the same time, and the system can't do that. So if you remove any surfaces that are not going to be seen, it avoids that problem. So if you can, remove them. So we need to do that on this wall as well. So hide these two. And again, we want to keep that bottom face. Mesh, separate, selected. So we're just naming these so that we know what they are in the outliner. And if they are similar objects, it's a good idea to use the same name for all of them, but then maybe add a numerical append so that if there's 5 of them, you have 1 through 5. And it just keeps everything tidy, so all the door frames are in their section, all the window frames are in their section, and then of course all the wall sections and so on. So let's save this, save as. So let's put in a garage door. So what's the best way of doing this? Let's just move one of the avatar helpers. So we're grabbing the seat node. And just putting it up near to that front wall so we can get a sense of height. So we want the garage door to be about that high. So let's use one of these pillars duplicate that. Whoops. reset. Just rotate it. So holding control to snap. And then just manipulate it to the height that we need. That's about right. Move it into position. Vertexes, we'll select these end vertices. So that's, again, we want incremental snapping, so holding control down snaps to too large an increment, so we can hold control and shift, snaps to smaller increments. And hopefully, because we have everything built to the grid, so we're using the grid, or utilizing as much of this as possible, so everything is regulated. So it should mean that everything basically snaps to either major or minor. So there we go. So what we can do now is get rid of these two faces, delete, we can vertex select these bottom vertices, hold control and move that up, move, whoops, and control shift, and that moves it into position. So we're trying to avoid this. So there's a slight bit of flickering there because two faces are occupying the same plane. They're in the same position, so they're coplanar or coincidental. We want to try and avoid things like that. So if we can, just butt edges to other edges. And again, this helps to be using everything. This helps to be setting everything on the grid. If they're not on the grid, what you then have to do is select a vertex or an edge. Doesn't really matter what. And in the item section of the sidebar, we have a Z value or a Z value. In this instance, that's 1650 meters. So if these were short, so we can use the Z value, Z value, to adjust the position, the height position of that vertex. Currently it's now at 1719.5. So if we select our vertex again, just to double check, 1650, so we select that vertex, click 1650, and it drops it into position precisely where we need it to be. Obviously, if the surface is angled, it's a bit more complicated to do that. But what we can do now is make a couple of cuts. So loop cut. Yeah, loop cut. Click that into place. And then loop cut. Click that into place. Deactivate the tool. So that first one is dead center where we need it to be, which is good. So this second one should still be, yes, it's snapped to the grid. So again, this is why it's always a good idea to try and make your scenes utilizing the grid as much as possible, because what we can do now, And we'll see why we're doing this in a second. Select that face. We can't see it. It's not going to be used. Remove it. We need to do the same thing on this face, not necessarily on this face only, because if we add a loop cut, it'll cut across the entire wall. So what we're going to do here, edge, whoops, select those two edges, so we're on a different wall now. Subdivide. So we've got a new edge down here, and again this should snap to increments, so focus in on that. Frame selected, whoops, Control Shift, and that is in place. Want to do that again at the top. Edge, subdivide. Where is that? So this one is slightly off kilter. Whoops. So that's 1550. So that's going to be 1650. And it plonks it where we need it to be. So there's a reason why we're going to be doing all of this. So we'll get rid of that face. And we want to do the same thing on this pillar, but that's part of the section that we were just editing. So edge, subdivide, move that into position. Select that edge, set, subdivide. So instead, because we know that's 1650, we can just select it, type, whoops, 1650, drops it into place, get rid of that face. What we want to do now, select all, so select all or the A key, mesh, clean up, merge by distance. And it's removed 4 vertexes, but let's just double check, increase the value, whoops, to 0.01. That's removed 8 vertices. So it's removed the vertexes, the duplicate vertexes that are at that point and around there. So essentially what that's doing, remove doubles, it's removing vertexes that pairs of or multiples of vertexes that occupy the same coordinates in 3D space. And this is the tolerance of the removal. So depending on how high that is, it will be aggressive or not so aggressive. So the reason for doing all of this is so that we can then do this. Oh no, it's not there, it's there. Let's make sure that's got our material. Because, and you want to be doing this based on this type of room. Because as we are looking at this room now, oh, we need to remove that back face from the window. As we are looking at this now, this is how the scene is going to be viewed in IMVU. So we want to see through the entire mesh with as little impediment to the view. So if we wanted to, we could even get rid of these back faces so that we can see through unobstructed. If I just hide those. Oh, and we have to make these materials, whoops, back face culled. So that was the new material that we created for the frames. Scroll down to the bottom, backface culling, and it'll be the same for the windows. So that means that we could see through the mesh. So there's nothing or there's very little impeding the view of the room. Otherwise, you end up with these big interferences that get in the way of the contents of the room, viewing the contents of the room. Although having a frame visible may mean people being able to frame the view to take snapshots. So depending on how you want your room to look, let's unhide those. Reveal hidden. So wherever possible, try and construct your rooms so that you don't have overlaps and unused faces visible on the mesh, so they end up obstructing the view of the room. But it means that your main room itself is still relatively composed properly. So what we want to do now is create a face across this gap, but because these are two separate wall sections, what we can do for this, select that bottom edge and extrude it up, holding Control, Shift, that gets us the height that we want. Assign our material. That's the top of the garage door. And that is a very simple front wall with the garage door opening. So what we could also do is add a utility door. So select that, bottom face, and the door itself, which is still attached. So copy or duplicate, reset, rotate 90 degrees, snap this into position, so we might need to do the incremental. That looks like it's out slightly, so we can check that. Move it into position. Detach it, because it's still attached to all of that. And then join it to our front face. So we're selecting the bit that we've just duplicated. Select the front wall, object, join. And then what we can do, in the same way that we did with this section at the top, we can use that set of properties to adjust this framework relative to this face, because we want it to be coplanar before we remove that back face. So that is the y-axis, and that's -50, whereas these are 48.40. So we select those, -50. So they're now coplanar, and we can kind of see that because we get that slight flickering. So select that face and delete it. And then what we can do, edge select, so that one is going to be the X value. That one. So we want this edge to be the same. What is it, 450? It'll be the same on the other side, but that might snap into position. So that's going to be 0.1 probably. 950. Yeah, it's 950. So again, another advantage of using a grid to build your rooms, you can generally guesstimate what the correct value for things are. So that was over by 1 unit. All we needed to do was just correct that by typing a 0 at the end, and it matches up. So duplicate our door frame. Let's turn on wireframe for these. So we're not looking at just bright colors. So select, duplicate, reset, rotate, then move into position. So we're getting somewhere. Save this, save as. So next what we can do is drop in a flat ceiling. And to do that, what we can do is utilize the parts that we've already created. So it doesn't matter what wall we choose. Just grab a beam, duplicate it, reset, separate, whoops, then select it, which can be a bit tricky. So use the outliner and rotate it horizontal. Grab, edit mode, grab these end vertexes, pull that across till it snaps in place. But let's make this a little higher because it is the roof beams, like so. And if we wanted, what we could also do with this edge loop, move that into place, at the end, because what we can do is a similar thing to what we did with this section. So we can get rid of that face that we've created. Same thing on the other end. Edge loop. Snap. Control Shift, smaller increments. Get rid of that face. So we now have a beam that has two notches in the end, that when we join all of this together, it'll all match up and we'll get a more optimized mesh based on what we were talking about, where we want to try and keep as many surfaces as possible. We want to prevent as many of them interfering with the view as the user is in the room looking in, because this is obviously a relatively small room. So that's one beam. So duplicate that. That's two. Duplicate it again. Move that to the end, where we need to create a notch in this one at this intersection. Edge loop. That is in place. Good. Edge loop. So one thing to note about the tools, when the tools are active, they'll stay active. So to deactivate them, you have to select one of the manipulation widgets. Otherwise they remain active. So that one is the Z. So because we rotated this object horizontally, the Z axis or the Z axis now represents what is essentially the Y axis of the scene. So keep an eye out on that when you are manipulating objects, that you alter, when time comes to doing that, the right values. So now we can get rid of, well, we can get rid of a couple of things on this. We don't need these back faces, so we can select all of these, and we don't need that inner face that we just created, so get rid of that. So what that's doing is creating a framework, so we can duplicate that. That's creating a framework around the room. Oh, invert. Oh, mirror this. That's mirror, mirror. So is this Y global? Nope, wrong one. Mirror X global. Shove that back into place. Because we mirrored it, we have to make sure that we apply location or rotation and scale, and then flip the surfaces. So when you are working on your rooms and faces appear inside out, or parts of the mesh appear inside out, that's likely because the face is the wrong way around. The way to solve that is not in IMVU to enable double-sided materials, so the way to solve that, whoops, why is it not moving? Oh, there we go. The way to solve that is not to enable double-sided, is to make sure that the surface is pointing in the right direction. So if we're moved too close to the object here for the sake of argument, but if this back face was visible, was not visible like this, so this section that we're seeing here, let's assume that that was the entire back face and that entire thing was invisible. The solution is not to enable two-sided, because what that does is it doubles up the amount of work that IMVU has to do rendering the object. What you want to be doing is making sure that all your faces are pointing the right way in Blender. And you can double check that in viewport overlays. There's an option to show the face orientation. With that enabled, everything either goes blue or it goes red depending on the orientation. So let me just flip these. Oh, that's because we need to disable double-sided. So there we go. If we enable two-sided, we can see the red color indicates the back face of a surface, the blue the front face, and we can see from enabling this option, where's it gone? There it is. By enabling that, we can see that the section that was just inverted is facing the wrong way. So all we need to do is go into mesh, normals, and flip it. The only time you should ever flip. So that's a handy tool, and it's something that you, oh, let's disable the backface culling because we don't want to see those. So again, with our materials, this is one of the other things that helps. If we disable, we have to disable, so we select our materials individually and then disable backface culling. So that's all the way down at the bottom in settings. And that basically then puts us into a point of view that essentially replicates what we would be seeing in IMVU if two-sided is disabled. So it should be disabled by default. So let's duplicate one of these middle beams. Reset, rotate 90 degrees. Whoops. Then move that to the back wall. We might have to do some finagling. Get this positioned exactly where we need it to be. And that is where we need it to be. Good. Well, it is from that point of view, so what we want to do is butt this up to that corner. So what we're going to do get rid of this stuff at the back because we don't need it. Grab this section, pull that across. Get rid of that face. Then we can get rid of that face. Do the same thing on the other side. Get rid of that face. And that face. So what we end up with is a neat corner in the corner of the room. But what we do have to do is cut a channel in this section. So loop cut. Where's loop cut? Yoink. Snap that. Loop cut. Yoink. That's slightly out. So which? Is that going to be 1300? Nope. Whoops. Yes, it is 1300. Loop cut. Loop cut. And then remove these faces. So we've got two to remove. One at the front, one underneath. Whoops. Then we can select these two faces and get rid of those. Get rid of those. And because we've done all that work, all we need to do is select that back beam, duplicate that, mirror it, and that is on the y-axis, I think. Mirror y-axis, yes it is. Move that up to the front and repeat removing these corner faces. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. And that. So what we end up with is, in this particular instance, it's because it's just a simple garage. What we end up with is a very neat and tidy mesh. So you can see into this, barring the door frames, we can see into this without anything from the room itself obstructing the view, which is what you want to be doing. But if you don't remove all of these faces, so if you don't take the time to do that, and it's not really that much effort, it's not really that much time, but if you don't take the time to do it, it can spoil the appearance of the room, because there could be a point of view where, let's say, the person is looking in through the corner of the room, but there's these surfaces are still in place on the back face here, or the back edge rather, and they interrupt what's visible looking from the outside of the scene. So it's always worth taking the time to do this stuff, because what we can then do is grab all those subframes and join them together. Object, join. Oh, so we forgot to do. So if we turn on backface again, we can see that we've got a set of faces that are the wrong way. So select those. Mesh, normals, flip. So everything's facing the right way now. Select all. And we need to remove doubles for this section. Clean up, merge by distance, and it's removed 24 vertexes. Because what we can now do, let's disable and backface culling, because what we can now do actually what we can do what we could do at this point is either fill this gap with a surface, so we have one large surface, or what we could do is, using these parts that we created earlier, we can duplicate those sections and create another beam that spans across the middle from this side to this side, so it spans across this section. In fact, let's do that. So what we can do, just so that we can see the process in action, so what we're going to do is use these surfaces, select them, just duplicate, so Shift D or Mesh, duplicate, and again snap to the grid, so we're holding the Control key down, and then Shift Snap for smaller increments. Get rid of this face, we don't need it now. Select these faces on the front, duplicate just those, move those into position, then Control Shift. And the reason for doing that is so that we don't waste too much time inverting and reverting and changing and flipping around the surfaces. So basically this side can be a copy of this, and this side can be a copy of this, and then all we do is just select all, mesh, clean up, merge by distance, and we remove the additional vertices that we've created. But what we also need to do, whoops, loop cut, snap, loop cut, snap. So if you're using SketchUp, this might be easier to do all of this, but in Blender we have to do it manually. But the same thing would apply in SketchUp as it does in Blender. So that measurement's out, which is the y-axis. So that's 450. Yeah, so that's minus 1450, minus 1450. And this time we want to get rid of that face, that face, that face, and that face. Leave the one at the bottom. So we end up creating this crossbeam. Select all, mesh, clean up, merge by distance, and it's removed the duplicates. So now we can create our ceiling. Two edges, and we need to assign a material to this so that it's separate. So that's our ceiling. So select all the panels, material properties, plus new, assign, and it'll do that by default. Let's give it a color. Call this ceiling. And then disable double-sided. So that is our flat-roofed garage meshed up. Let's exit edit mode, object mode. Obviously it doesn't need to be this relatively detailed, but if you do start adding beams and structure, as we've been discussing, it's always a good idea to make sure that you have clean cuts and clean corners and remove all the surfaces that aren't being used so that they don't impede the view that the user has of the room. That's assuming that we're essentially making a room that looks like the inside only, so it's just an inside shell. So what we can also do whilst we're here is reset the origin of some of these, because the one for the roof is all the way out over here. So what we can do is replace the cursor 0, 0, 0. So that is now at the center of the grid. Whoops. Object selected, object, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. So that is our room. So what we're going to do next, we'll do this in the next stream, it's been going for about an hour and about 20 minutes or so. What we'll do in the next stream is take a look at adding materials to this, as in textures. So what we've already got are materials that we've been using just to distinguish what we've been working on, so we can easily see what each component is. So what we need to do next is generate some textures, and that then means UV mapping the objects. So each of these will need their own UV map so that we can assign a texture to it so that it appears, which is what then people will derive from. So let's just save our progress so far. Save as. And we'll call it quits there until the next stream. So yes, we'll go over materials in the next stream. And then hopefully that shouldn't take as long because it's relatively straightforward. So we may be able to do a basic export test in the next stream as well. So we can reposition our seating. So what we might do as well, so what we could do, where are our blocks? We could drop the blocks in as furniture items that are included with the room and move those around, and then position the seating nodes relative to those blocks, because some rooms include furniture, some rooms don't. And that will allow us to just do a basic export test where we can test this in IMVU and see what it looks like. So hopefully, we'll definitely do materials. Hopefully we'll get an export test out of this. So until the next stream, we shall call it quits there and see you anon, as they say. Bye for now.